Hey Ilo, how's it going? Hope you're fantastic. Now, if there's one thing that unites all of us Kendama players, it is that feeling of missing that spike. Now, how bad are we when we miss that spike? There's obviously an incredible number of factors, but if we break it down into its in a vacuum, ideal logic, potentially a little bit inaccurate state, we can kind of figure there's an area of yes spike and there's an area of no spike, and we can try to find out what are the odds of spiking any kendama trick. So I'm going to mathematically calculate and lay out and experimentally verify exactly how likely you are to spike a kendama trick and what that exact percentage of time will be that a trick should spike, and then I will show you what you can do to make that percentage a little bit higher for yourself. Alright, so let's start here. I've kind of broken it down here, and I'll break it down over here. I have this chrome pop which I've used for this whole analysis, and this has a 60mm tama, which is a pretty common size for a tama, and that 60mm is the diameter, so the girth of this sphere, if you will. That's a 60mm diameter, which would mean a 30mm radius, and if we want to figure out how much pokeable area there is, how much area could the spike hit, we just need the surface area of this sphere as it is. Well, I did get a degree in math, so let me Google how to calculate the surface area of a sphere. That is what I did. 4 pi r squared to get the surface area of this tama, and we know that our radius is that 30mm, so bing 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 bing, making sure we square the 31st order of operations, we ended up with 11,310 square millimeters of possible poking area that the spike could hit when we do our kendama trick. Now, I will acknowledge that the tama is not a perfect sphere, because where the hole is and the bevel is, it's kind of got a little slice taken out of it. Now, we're going to account for that because we're going to have to kind of estimate what our successful spiking area is. It won't just be as simple as measuring this hole. And when we do make that estimate, I'm going to overshoot the mark a little bit because we'll take it as a flat area, but when the flat area wraps around the surface of the tama, it gets a little bit smaller anyway. So if we estimate it big when the tama would have been a sphere, but now it's got the flat spot, it should all work out. Alright, so onto that spikeable area. We had to make a decision here as to what area we'll call success and what area we'll say, that's beyond a successful spike. Here's why it's complicated though, because we're thinking about the spike as like a single point hitting this sphere, right? It could hit here, could hit the bevel here, so on and so forth. So if we just say that hitting the whole bevel here is a success, then that would mean if the tama is coming down at an angle like this onto the spike, we hit the bevel. If we claimed that was a success, we'd say, yes, success percentage triggered, but that's just not the case. Not every single bevel poke is going to be a success, so it's a little tricky. So here's what I did. At any angle where the actual hole, not just the bevel, but the actual spike hole is hittable, we're going to call that a success. And then for any spike that hits at like a 45-degree angle or less in the bevel, which accompanies like this space that I'm trying to help you visualize, because 45 degrees, okay, we could say if you hit the bevel it'll go in, but if you're beyond that 45, maybe not. So that's what we're going with, that 45 degree, which is really a 90-degree, space of successful spiking of the bevel. That's what we're going to go with as our success. So how are we going to translate that into an area that we can actually calculate? We can take here our successful area to be halfway between the inner and the outer bevel, which might be a bit too optimistic, but then when we wrap it around the sphere, it's going to make that area a bit smaller. So again, it kind of balances out. So how big is that, area actually going to be? This kendama specifically has a 21mm outer bevel and a 13mm inner bevel. So in between there is a 17mm successful area diameter estimate. And 17mm diameter circle, we need the surface area of that circle to be our successful poking place. So pi r squared for circle area, half of 17 is 8.5 squared. So times that by pi, we get about 227 square millimeters of successful spiking space. And then easy, 227 square millimeter success of that total 11,310 square millimeter spikeable area is almost exactly 2%, assuming that you're hitting the Tama directly onto the spike every time you go for the trick. So that's our baseline. No matter how complicated the trick is, or how you get into it, if you manage to hit the spike with the Tama, you've got about a 2% chance of actually landing that trick. So before we continue on to how you can actually make that 2% chance a bit better for yourself, I am going to experiment and see how close practicality is to that mathematical estimate. So I'm using this kind of hand smack random spinny motion to approximate a random Tama falling, and I'm going to do this 100 times to see how many times this presumably randomly spinning Tama is landing on the spike. Now, as you're watching the trials go along, there are two issues with this method. The first is a problem that has plagued experimentation for absolute centuries, and that is that it is super difficult to simulate actual randomness. It's hard to actually come up with a way, in this case, to have the Tama truly randomly hit the spike. So this is the best approximation I could do, but since I'm even involved in the experiment at all, it's not perfectly random. And as you can see, we ended up with 5 successes out of the trial of 100 attempts, which is better than 2%. So you may say, oh, the practical odds of spiking a trick are actually 5%. But no. I think this random experiment has also fallen victim to the very way that we can make our odds a little bit better, which is the second issue, which now is changing itself from an issue in experimentation to a method that we can use to make our odds of spiking that much better. So yeah, if the Tama is randomly spinning, we've got about a 2% chance of it spiking. But some tricks keep the Tama spinning on a very specific axis, which increases those odds. So I've listed some things down here. Consider the earth turn, or the whirlwind, or a simple pull-up spike. Something like the earth turn, for example, it's always going to initiate the spin of the Tama from like the hole itself. So if I'm doing this, right, or maybe from this angle, you can see that the spin is initiated from the hole itself, same with the whirlwind, or the pull-up spike initiates the turn from the string hole, which is opposite the hole, so same difference when it comes to the axis of rotation. These tricks, because they initiate that spin from the hole or across from the hole, they put the Tama on this path. Let me show you. It's going to be like this, right? Like the Tama is going to be spinning, and it's only going to be spinning this way. The hole keeps coming around. I got to keep moving the string. But like areas like this and this, like these are fail zones, but they're never going to be hit by the spike because we're following this single axis. It's not going in a way that we could hit any place. We're only going to hit somewhere on the Tama along this straight axis. I hope that makes sense. I'll try to illustrate it to make sense. And then like with this too, in ideal situations, we can just consider the areas that are even possibly spikeable just like a straight line along and around that axis. Those are really the only points that we're going to hit. So how much of the center line is a failure? If I try to measure with this conveniently placed string, I can wrap it around, kind of mark it, and then I have, this length of string. I can measure it out with a ruler, and I get that total center line being about 189 millimeters, but realizing that my education didn't fail me, I can just find the circumference of this based on something we know, which is the diameter. So that 60 millimeter diameter times pi should be the length all the way around the Tama, and boom, that's 188.5 millimeters. So we'll go with that, but my measuring was not that bad. The line of success in this case, assuming it's spinning like in that perfect axis, we'll do the same thing we did before, in between the outer bevel and the inner bevel. So that same 17 millimeter, space diameter of the success area. So just that 17 out of the 188.5 millimeters along that center line takes us up to 9% chance of success. So if you have the Tama spinning on that perfect axis, as you do in an earth turn or a whirlwind, etc., and you're making sure that you actually hit the spike, against the Tama, then you're up to a 9% chance of spiking just by making sure that your axis is spinning nicely and you're hitting the Tama. No, that's not too bad, and we can test that just for fun as well. I'm trying here to make sure that the earth turns are like kind of random. I'm trying not to get into a pattern where I would just accidentally consistently do a double or a triple. I'm trying to raise, lower the can, and make sure that the earth turns are kind of random so that we don't have to expect the same thing to happen on every attempt. We want these to be random earth turns so that we're getting that axis of rotation staying aligned, but the trials are actually randomly poking the spike somewhere along that line. And pulling our results the same way we did it in the first trial, 11 out of 100 spiked, which I think is pretty telling to our theory, which isn't really a theory. It's pretty clear that a Tama spinning along that axis of rotation will definitely boost your odds. I mean, maybe in some cases there, just because I'm a Kendama player, I'm subconsciously throwing like a consistent earth turn feeling motion, and I might be spiking a little more than like a totally random scenario would. But I think that 11% is pretty close to that 9%, you know, potato, we see that our odds have definitely increased. So there you have it. I mean, no matter how messy your trick is, you've got a 2% chance of spiking it. And then if you're able to, even in a juggle or earth or whatever trick, if you're able to spin your Tama along an axis where the bevel is at the cross, I still haven't figured out a good way to explain it, but you know what I mean. If you have that perfectly aligned spin, you are up to a 9% chance of spiking. So in the general sense, the 2%, if you try a trick 50 times and you poke it every time, like one of those statistically should hit. Otherwise, you can start blaming bad luck. But you can't blame bad luck until you at least give it 50 good attempts. That's what we've learned. And yeah, that's, I guess, class dismissed. And I hope you enjoyed this lecture. All right, peace. Enjoy your success areas, as always.